it's our space to connect with one another and to remind us of the value of continuing to forge relationships in this physical distancing world. So as we delve further into meaning this week, it seems appropriate to really also talk about the grief process, since all of us, to some degree, have experienced some kind of loss in these very odd times. For some of us, it might have been the loss of a loved one to coronavirus or to something else. Other things that are just kind of happening in our life that have brought forth kind of turmoil for us. Some of us have experienced job loss, and others it's a loss of normalcy, a loss of routine. So we can think of this as a psychological process going on for us that many people have called grief for decades. It might be different for some of us to think about this as a grieving process, but I think it's a useful framework to think about this work. And so those of you that have looked at grief or thought about grief, you would almost have to have run into Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on the stages of grief. And as I say them, they'll kind of, remember them if you haven't already, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But what you might not know is that recently a sixth stage has been added to that process, and that is our topic of meaning. So if we think about this a little bit, we can turn to the work of David Kessler, who was one of the collaborators and studied with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I thought I would read a little bit of a quote from him and why meaning was added as a stage to this process. And then we'll look at all this in terms of coronavirus. So David Kessler says, "I've been honored that the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's family has given me permission to add a sixth stage to grief called meaning. I had talked to Elizabeth quite a bit about what came after acceptance. I did not want to stop at acceptance when I experienced some personal grief." So maybe we can relate to that as well, that after we get to acceptance, I noticed it in myself before, that there's a longing for more, to do more with that. Then David went on to say, "I wanted meaning in those darkest hours. And I do believe we find light in those times. Even now, people are realizing they can connect through technology. They're not as remote as they thought. They're realizing that they can use their phones for long conversations. They're appreciating walks. I believe we will continue to find meaning now and when this is over." So again, that's from David Kessler. So if we then put this all together and think about how this has played out for us in coronavirus, and think about this for yourself, of how which stages you've experienced. We don't necessarily experience the stages in sequence, like it has to be denial, then anger, then bargaining. We can experience stages together at the same time. We can experience 3 of them or 5 of them. But in general, these are the 6 in any order. But sometimes it is actually in this order. So denial is the first. So you might think back, did you have any denial? Do you have any denial right now with regard to our current situation? There might be, phrases like, this isn't happening. They can't expect us to quarantine and for this long. These would be denial thoughts and statements that we might have said to ourselves. Now, I recall in the early days just a surreal feeling, which is a way that the mind is processing this thing called denial. I felt a sense of surreal, like what is reality and what is not reality with this? This seems just so off that the world would be quarantining like this. So these are kind of denial experiences, and then anger. We might have felt anger. Maybe a softer way to call it would be frustration. Some people don't like to say the word anger, so you could say frustration or agitation, aggravation, irritation. These would all be in the anger phase or stage. And this is where we might say things like, "You mean I can't leave the house? This is ridiculous." And we would have, thoughts of a sort of a loss of control feeling like we're not suddenly not in charge of our life and the way things are going. And then that manifests in very significant ways for many of us when it comes to job and child rearing and friendships and so on. And then there's the bargaining phase. So we might say something like, how about I just go out 3 times a week instead of 5 times a week to stores? Or I can agree to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even a month of physical distancing, but that's about it. So these are kind of bargaining, like we're negotiating with the world in that sense type of phase. So you might have caught some of those phrases in your mind a few weeks ago, maybe even right now, as many places, some countries, some cities, some states are beginning to loosen restrictions, and some have already completely loosened restrictions. So the bargaining will increase, no doubt. And for many of us, a big phase, a serious phase, a painful phase is depression. And so that's the sense of, the hopelessness. This is never going to end. Things are just changed forever, and it's awful. This is awful for me personally. My life is ruined. My life is in chaos. I just feel so sad. I don't know what to do. I'm hopeless. Sometimes in psychology we think of the 3 H's when it comes to depression: hopeless, helpless, and hapless. Hapless means unlucky. So we might have felt 1 or 2 or 3 of the H's when it comes to the depression phase of the grieving process. And then, some of us have noticed glimmers of light at the end of the tunnel, or finding it in the darker hours of acceptance. And so that's the phase where we might have phrases in our head and a sense of feeling that this is for the best. This is for the best of my health, my family's health, that better off in the long run for this. I may not like it, but I understand why we're doing this. This is where the perspective strength really comes in. And in some very, very early preliminary research on the character strengths with coronavirus coping, I've noticed that perspective as a character strength is one of the ones that people are reporting the most. I'm not saying it's number 1, but it's one of the ones, certainly the biggest one in the wisdom category of the VIA classification. So perhaps you're tapping into that. I would say I'm tapping into that much more than I am the other strengths in the wisdom category. That sense of trying to keep the bigger picture in mind, and where is this all going? And so what Kessler was arguing and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross might have been arguing or agreeing is that there's something more beyond acceptance, and that's the stage of meaning. So this is where we take acceptance a little bit further. That acceptance has this wonderful feeling of where we can kind of let go a little bit and connect. And then meaning helps us to really deepen that connection. And so this 6th stage that they're arguing for might be phrases like, we actually, it's more questions for ourselves, of ourselves finding meaning in it. It wouldn't be for me to say how you would find meaning in it, but this is where you might say, how might my family gain from all this? What is the benefit of all of this? What might I learn having gone through this time in history? What might I learn from this? What does it all mean for me? So we might say things like, well, I'm finding meaning by having, like for me, I'm connecting a lot more with my family. That has its struggles and stresses, but it also has its joys to have my kids around so much more. It gives me more time to connect with them. So we can look for what is our meaning with regard to this whole situation. Now, just a reminder, so those stages that I just went through, those 6 stages, do not necessarily have to happen in that particular order. We repeat them, so you might do some bargaining, and then you're kind of in denial a little bit, feeling some frustration and anger, getting some acceptance as you kind of learn something new, and then trying to seek out a little bit more meaning. Then you go back to feeling angry because of, this stuff still going on, and then you go back to acceptance. So we can bounce around with the different stages, and you might not relate to 2 or 3 of them. So as is the case when we've talked about forgiveness here and when we've talked about a lot of different things, this is a process is really the best way to describe grieving, rather than as stages, as I've used that word a couple times. A better way to say it is this is a process that unfolds within us. So I thought to turn it to you for a moment and reflect on this a little bit more for yourself. So if you think back to when this all started for you in your country, whether that was in February, for some of you it might have even been late December or January, but for some of us it was more February or March. When you think back to when this started, and what have you gone through? What have you felt? Which of these areas, these feelings, these quote unquote stages have you really experienced? Maybe you've been stuck in one. So we experience freedom in the naming. So this is why it's important. Some of those words can be helpful where we name the phase that we might find ourselves in. I would even invite you to get specific on naming your loss. If you think of some of this as a loss, whether it's an actual loss of a person or whether it's a psychological loss, you might start with that. What is your loss in the last couple months, if you were to name that? I mean, during this time period, I lost a cousin, not to coronavirus, but to other causes. My wife also experienced a death, one of her friend's brothers. So a number of other kind of losses, loss of routine. For me, if I was, doing this reflection right now with you, I would say a loss of freedom would be probably my biggest. Not freedom in the sense of going off and driving around in the world, but I had a lot of freedom where I would work from home and have the whole day to just kind of do whatever I wanted to do with my work. And I'm going to write this and do this, and had a routine for a very long time doing that and getting a lot done. And it's been a loss of freedom with my work. I mean, I still get to work full time, but with all the extra things of needing to do. As I've mentioned, I have to feed my kids and I have to educate my kids. I have to do all these different things. So what is your loss? Then as you think about that loss, with your eyes open or closed, and you think about those different feelings, perhaps you can discover some meaning in it all. What does the loss mean for you? We acknowledge the suffering of it, the struggle of it, and at the same time, what might we uncover on a growth level? What might we discover for ourselves? So we're not in any way trivializing our loss. We're not escaping it. We feel the suffering of it. And at the same time, we look for a sense of meaning. Where does this fit in the bigger picture of our life and for the world? How might you grow? whatever insights you have there, just make note of them, write them down. Feel free to chat them right now. But rather than reading the chats at the moment, I'll continue on and we'll come back to that. But hold that for a moment of the meaning that you're taking from your own loss. And let's now bring in character strengths even more concretely. As we experienced hopefully on Monday, these character strengths are really at the core of meaning and are a central pathway to meaning. And there have been different studies that have looked at character strengths and meaning. So I'm going to extract a few of those character strengths that we can reflect on for a moment here. So in looking at 3 different studies of character strengths and meaning, the character strengths that come up in the top 5 at least twice, so in 2 or 3 of the 3 studies, are spirituality, which came up in all 3, by the way, curiosity, hope, zest, gratitude, and perspective. So I want to invite you now to think of yourself as hopeful. See yourself as hope. Become hope. See the depth and the meaning of your hope strength. Think of yourself as grateful. Really see yourself right now as grateful. You know and I know that you have that strength within you. So see that strength now. Become gratitude. Notice how meaningful your gratitude is. Meaningful for you, meaningful for your family when you express it. Think of yourself as having strong perspective. That strength of wisdom that helps you to see the bigger picture, to put it all together. See yourself with perspective. Become perspective. And notice how meaningful your perspective is. How impactful it is when you share it with your family. And so all of these strengths, spirituality, curiosity, hope, zest, gratitude, and perspective, all of these meaning strengths are very strong. You can tap into any of them. You can remember that throughout your day with your family, with your loved ones.